deeper understanding of what environmental justice burdens affect their community specifically. Thank you. So EJ scores are calculated on the census tract level. So it is the second smallest government data set that's collected. It targets 5 key domains, so that's health, demographic, environmental exposure, environmental effects, and climate change. And I'll be going through in depth what each of those data sets contain. We try to update it annually or biannually based off of public data updates with a pretty long delay over COVID, which I will get into later. And every year we go out to communities and showcase this tool and how it can be used for different grant writing opportunities and the like, and take in feedback from community members and try to incorporate it into our next available build. So as I said, the tool calculates the EJ scores on the census tract level. So here is the general diagram of how geography is split up in the United States. Obviously there's the country, the state, and the county, and then the census tracts are the next size down. They are roughly, I think the census statistical method is to try to make the shapes are contiguous, so they're just solid shapes, and they have roughly the same amount of people for each census block. So you can have some rural census tracts that are quite large, but they should have roughly the same amount of people as one in the city, which are much smaller. So as I mentioned, the point of this tool is to help communities specifically try to have a better understanding of all of the data that's being collected by the government and by by the state and national agencies, and try to condense all the information that's being collected into a number that can be understood by anybody. So the way we do this is we take open source data, so that's basically any information that's publicly available online, maybe not necessarily free, although we try to use mostly free data. We take the information from community members, basically asking them individually, one-on-one, what are some things you've noticed in your neighborhood or community that harm your or increase your environmental burden. We try to take that information and find data sets to match up with those experiences. We condense all that into the MD EJSCREEN and then disperse it back out to the communities so they can have a numerical understanding of what is going on. So why not just use another tool? Obviously we are not the only EJSCREEN tool. Many states have their own individualized one, and now there is also a federal tool, several federal tools that do mostly the same thing. Why don't we ask communities to use them? Well, they can, and they absolutely should. We created a Maryland tool to specifically address the environmental conditions of Maryland, the state, which has obviously very different concerns from a place like Louisiana or Arkansas or Alaska, right? So we tailored our data set to things that would be most relevant to Maryland. We also used a lot of locally collected Maryland data. So this is things collected by the Maryland state government or data collected by community scientists on a statewide scale. The purpose of the tool isn't necessarily to determine the conditions of Maryland as part of the United States, but to consider Maryland individually. Yes, sir.
Well, I apologize if you indicated earlier, of course I did, but you wanted to hold questions till the end. But I'm just curious, I followed in general, because I just saw this morning a similar session for Maryland, for Virginia and Delaware. Do I understand that within the community age kind of share influence, you've done a statewide, you created statewide screen tools, and that's why maybe not having done one for California?
So the question was states have created individualized tools, and the fact that we're based in Maryland, we haven't done one for another state. Is that
Well,
correct?
I think in the agenda, there's a similar section, a tool having been created for Virginia and
Right.
Delaware. And they both read the US Maryland CEJ to sphere influence. I'm assuming that's why they exist.
So the question is, why do the other state screens, including West Virginia and Delaware, exist as a product of our influence, of the influence of SIEGE or UMD in general? So it's actually not on us. Those people have done their own terrific work. The creation of EJScreens is a relatively new idea. I think California was, in fact, I believe, the first state to create a publicly available EJScreen tool, and I want to say they did that in the early 2010s, so it's a pretty recent development. A lot of the reason is mostly because the technology wasn't really there to do it on a wide scale. So it's a part of a general idea within the EJ sphere of creating community-centered data tools so that communities can advocate for themselves using informed and scientific language that can be reflected in legislation that can be generally understood by the wider populace. Does that help answer your question? No, of course. So, back on why we are making individualized tools. Maryland, like I said, has very unique environmental burden concerns that are not the same as any other state, and so we created this tool just for Maryland. What we need to use this as is as a sense of perspective for the rest of the country, right? So if we looked at it in a national scale, Maryland might be on the better end or the worse end. That doesn't really help give context to people in their individualized communities because it's on such a large scale. So we shrink the scale and create a more specific understanding of Maryland itself. So this is what the tool looks like currently. So it's a pretty simple tool to use. You have your EJ domains on the side with the cumulative score always on the first bracket, and then you have your choropleth or color-coded map. The map shows values in percentiles, which I'll go into a little bit more detail later. And by later, I mean now. When you select on any one track within the map, you see a pop-up that shows all of the numbers. What do these numbers mean? These numbers are percentiles. Percentiles are a way to condense a wide range of data into percentages of the total collection of data. Basically, easily translated, that just means the higher the number, the more census tracts are better than the one you've selected. And even more simplistically, the higher the number, the worse the data shows the environmental burden is for any one specific domain. So for this one, we can see that health is in kind of the median range, so that means 68% of all of the rest of the census tracts in Maryland have a lower health environmental justice quotient than this one specifically in Prince George's County, whereas for instance for environmental exposure, it's 100%. So there are no census tracts that have a worse environmental exposure quotient than this one in Prince George's County. So how did we develop this score? So the score was a product of, it's a product of the CalEviroScreen. So we use the methodology with some changes from the CalEviroScreen, which equivalently weights all of the environmental justice concerns. So as I mentioned, those are environmental exposure, environmental effects, health, demographics, and then we added one specifically to reflect the climate change. We take all of the data and we hoover it up into a single index by calculating the EJ score as a product of the population quotient. Basically, we take whatever variable we're looking at, we multiply it by the proportion of the whole state's population is in the census tract that we're looking at, and then we average the two data sets together and turn them into a percentile. So the raw value is generally meaningless. So we don't usually publish the raw values of our EJ score because the ranges vary very widely, because there are some counties that have very little environmental justice burden and are doing just fine. They have a lot of forest, they don't have a lot of polluting plants, have high healthcare rates, things of that nature, while there are others that are doing extremely poorly. And if we showed the raw values, they would be from here to here. So we turn it into percentiles to make it a little bit easier to understand. Next slide. So as I mentioned, if you go into any individual census tract, this is for the total environmental justice score. So what we do in order to create the condensed score is we take the individualized percentiles and then average them in groups of 2, and then average those groups together. So doing this off the top of my head, but I believe demographic and health are averaged out into a single value and then averaged again with the combination of environmental exposure, environmental effects, and climate change. And here's the data that we use. Like I mentioned, all of the data we pull is open source, which means you can find the raw values yourself and recreate our tools. You know, a lot of that data comes from the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, the US Census, NASA, and the EPA, and we also use data from state agencies, so the Maryland Department of the Environment, and oh my God, there's another one. The name escapes me. But we use a couple other, oh my God, Public Works? I can't remember. In order to create these tools and get these numbers. Next slide, please. So so real quick, I'm just going to kind of run through what data sets we collect and just give you a bit of understanding of how we converted the data into the values we use for the tool. So for environmental exposure, you see we have AQI, NO2 density, traffic density, surface and groundwater nitrate violation, diesel proximity, which basically just means how much diesel is being used within a certain area, manure use, and leaky storage tanks. So as you can kind of tell, most of these are environmental pollutants that kind of leach out into the surrounding areas. They are all weighted equivalently within each domain, and then each domain itself is weighted equivalently. AQI has always been a thorn in our side because even though there is a lot of air quality data being collected, it's being collected on such a large scale that it's hard to really condense it down to a very small locality. So we are looking to integrate new data collection methods to kind of branch out how we collect that AQI data specifically. Currently we're using data collected from NASA's satellites, which kind of obviously hovers overhead and takes pictures of the density of the clouds and can use photogrammetry, I believe it's called, to determine the composition of the air within that photograph, and then they give us those numbers and we kind of convert it into a AQI quotient. Next slide, please. For the environmental effects, this is generally for production facilities and chemical plants, so we have proximities to petroleum and rubber plants, brownfields, CAFOs, mines, incinerators, and so forth. These are things that are generally parts of industry, and so we check how close certain localities are to these facilities, and then that number is how we determine the impact for that locality. So next slide. So to go into this a little bit more in depth, we use a proportional impact model, which basically looks at the center of each census tract and creates a kind of circle around it. Anything captured in that circle is considered to have an impact within the census tract. We generally use a 5-kilometer radius in order to determine that. The impact, though, is inversely proportional to the distance. What does that mean? That basically means the farther you are away, farther the center of the census tract is away from the facility itself, the less impact that facility has on the census tract in question. This has a few assumptions integrated into the model, which those assumptions being that the population is equivalently distributed and that the impact is equivalently or inversely distributed. Both of those assumptions may not be true depending on the pollution. So a lot of the data, a lot of the proximal assessment is, excuse me, a lot of the proximal assessment is basically trying to make a conscious trade-off between generalization and specification. So we tried to make it a bit more specific without kind of ruining the math behind it. So next slide. Health almost entirely came from the CDC, 500 places data set. There was a single data set from, I believe, FEMA that collects the cancer risk associated with various pollutants that was also used as part of this data set. All of the data that CDC collects, they distribute in percentiles, so we didn't have to actually do any conversion from the original data set. Next slide. And then demographic indicators encompass both demographics and socioeconomic characteristics. We looked at things like education, healthcare, proximity to public services, so these are your fire trucks and your hospitals and so forth. We also looked at things like linguistic isolation and energy burden. Things are a bit more amorphous but still have a very defined impact on people's general environmental burden. Next slide, please. And then the last one is climate change. And you might look at it and say, wow, this is a lot smaller than the other ones. That's because we integrated the entirety of the National Risk Index, which has which is itself an index and is a large composite data set. So so that includes things like flood risk, the impact of sea level rise, and so forth into a single number. And I wish I could go into more detail about the tree coverage analysis, because that was my favorite part. But for the tree coverage analysis, we used the NLCD data set, the National Land Cover data set, which takes aerial photographies of large portions of the United States, converts those squares into coverage density points, basically it says, all right, this place with no trees is 1 density, and this place with all the trees, so many trees we can't see the ground, is 5 density. So I converted those numbers into a proportional aerial assessment, which basically looks at all of the tree coverage within a census tract, gives a value to the density of each data point within that census tract, and then looks at the proportional coverage of trees for the entire population. So it condenses all that to a single value, and then you kind of divide that value by the amount of people in that census tract as compared to the rest of the state. And then we also use days over 100 degrees, which are getting more frequent. Next slide. So we get all this data, we put it all together into a single package, and then we get these numbers. And sometimes these numbers are very confusing. And this is the one that actually a colleague of mine pointed out to me recently, that I'd never really taken the time to think of, why is this way? So we're looking right here at the updated EJ scores of College Park, Maryland, where we are currently. And you can see on the slides, it is really high. It is very high, somewhat inconceivably so, right? There's no factories nearby. There's no, there's lots of trees outside. It's a nice sunny day here in College Park, and there's not a lot of pollution. So why are these numbers the way that they are? Next slide, please. And then we dive a little bit deeper, right? So we're looking at the health numbers right now. And as you can see, all of these percentiles, so we have, chronic heart disease, COPD, smoking, diabetes, high cholesterol, they're all pretty much on the lower end of the percentiles, right? So we're looking, I think the highest one up there is obesity at 35%, core M just context, is preventative care for males. So how many men are getting preventative care? So that's actually a good one you want to have higher. Okay, these are all really low numbers. Why is it the way that it is? Next slide. The problem we came to realize was in the demographic data set. So College Park, Maryland, probably as part of being a college campus, has a very diverse, large population, and it has generally low income because most of the people who live here are college students, right? That kind of all tracks. The reason that these numbers for the overall EJ score for this particular census tract is so high is a result of these, which tells us a few things. Next slide. It tells us that the equivalent weighting method that's being used currently at least by MD EJSCREEN, but probably for most other EJ screens, is not entirely accurate. It creates a lot of errors. It misrepresents how the harm is impacting the community because it over-relies on the general socioeconomic characteristics of a tract to determine impact. Impact doesn't happen just to the people who live there. It can happen to the people who pass through there, who live near there, who may not have even heard of this place, but the air pollution carries over to the next town, right? So these are not considerations that EJ screens really are designed to capture. That those would take individualized tools to kind of get a more narrow view of what is happening in a small area, especially for things that are not confined to census tracts, right? So, like I mentioned, pollution is not confined to your census tract. If water runoff happens, it doesn't stay in your block. It goes elsewhere and infects other places. That is not something that can be captured here. And the other thing is population size and demographic makeup, as I said, are overrepresented in the data set. Population size specifically is overrepresented. As we go through the demo, I'll point out a few census tracts that have suspiciously low EJ scores. The reason they have suspiciously low EJ scores is because nobody lives there. These are places like in Curtis Bay where there's petroleum plants and the like, where nobody actually lives on the census tract that contains these plants. So the EJ score calculates those scores as near or at 0 because there's nobody impacted by the way the model is run. Next slide. Kind of brings into the general limitations of what an EJ index does, and really any index tool in general. EJ indexes are not a diagnostic tool. Cannot stress that enough. You cannot look at an EJ score and determine what is wrong with your neighborhood. You can only really use it to determine how your neighborhood stacks up in reference to the rest of your state, or if you use a national scale tool, the rest of the nation. Why is that? Does that make this tool useful? No, not at all. What it's used for is as a starting point to do a deeper dive into your community's environmental issues. So if you go and you look up your own community on the MD EJSCREEN or on the EPA EJSCREEN, and you see something that maybe surprises you, like you look at your neighborhood, and your neighborhood has a pretty reasonable EJ score, right? Maybe in the 20s or 30s, right? Not perfect, obviously, but not that bad. But then you look deeper into the data and you see, oh, even though we have a low EJ score, it seems like we have a lot of chemical runoff in our neighborhood as compared to the rest of the state or the country. That's how you should be using this to kind of target individual issues and find the aspects that might merit a deeper dive. The main limitation that EJ scores also run up to is recency. A lot of the data set that the MD EJSCREEN uses, and almost every EJSCREEN uses, is the federal data sets. Those data sets are updated irregularly or regularly over a large time span. For instance, the census, we get a new American Community Survey, I believe, every 2 or 5 years. I think it's 2 years. we get the next data set, which is the data set that most researchers use. A lot can happen in 2 years. COVID in particular was caused a drought of data from the US government because a lot of people were either shifted to other more dire projects, or the data wasn't properly captured during that time period. NLCD is a great example of this. The most recent NLCD data set, the National Land Cover data set, I believe is 6 years old at this point, which, on the timeline of trees isn't a lot, but still a lot can happen in those 6 years. So it does create a fair bit of discontinuity between what the data set shows and what might actually be happening. The other thing that is a big issue is the scope, basically the resolution of the data. So as I mentioned, most of these data sets are built off of census tracts, and those census tracts can be pretty large. The issue is that most of the data in the country is collected on a census tract level. Ideally, we would like to go to the census block level, which is the next level down, has a smaller area, smaller population, but also would give us a more specific idea of what's happening in each individualized community. But that data isn't homogeneous, or that data isn't collected homogenously throughout the rest of the federal government or even state government. We also have, in my opinion, a good thing, but a bit of a frustrating thing, is that counties are starting to have their own data collection units, which is great, more public data for people to be using, and they usually collect it on the street level. So they usually will be providing you information on a block by block level, which would be perfect if it was collected consistently through every county and every state in the country, which is a pretty high bar to pass. The other issues were the ones I mentioned earlier about data, which are the fact that a lot of the data is collected or is analyzed using this equivalently weighted system. And we also use a lot of interpolated values. Interpolation is basically looking at one point and determining what that value might be at another point on the map. It is a statistically valid method and statistically sound, but it does produce error. It's kind of inevitable with any data science. And so we have to kind of do a better job of communicating and understanding that error that's produced and how that might impact the conclusions that can be made. Yes, sir.
Focusing on this state, how many counties in Maryland, what are they, that might have initiated their own scoring process? And why would they have done it? Because they wanted to counteract maybe the higher score that the schools, the ECEJ scorecard is?
So the question, oh, sorry, continue.
And then quickly, if that's not the reason, why are the counties doing it, the ones that are?
Sure. So the question was, why are counties creating these data sets, and is it to kind of counter the misinterpretations that might be gathered from the SIEGE, MD EJSCREEN, or just any EJSCREEN? And sorry, what was the second part of your question?
Well, the first part was also which counties.
Oh, which counties, yeah.
But if it's not respond to maybe the higher scores,
Right, why are they?
why are they doing it?
Okay, and if it's not to respond to the scores, why are they doing this? Well, I think there might be, I might have miscommunicated something a little bit. They're not, most counties, in my understanding, are not making their own EJ score. They're just collecting their own data in general. So this could be health data. This could be, data about just like public streets and things of that nature, where are all the fire hydrants, where are all the trees, things like that. That's a lot of the data that counties are collecting. I don't know specifically which counties might in Maryland have their own data source. Maryland is a little bit unique, actually, that they have a very robust publicly available data unit, for lack of a better term. I believe it's called IMAP Maryland, IMAP Maryland. If you just Google that, you should be able to find it. And that contains all of the public data that Maryland has to offer. It's a great resource, and kudos to the people in Maryland state government who put that together. Why do they do that? It's because data is, there's that overused term nowadays that data is the new oil. It is incredibly valuable to know what's happening. And that's why counties are collecting that data. In fact, I believe I was reading in the Washington Post a couple weeks ago that there's a big problem in indigenous communities because they don't have enough data about what's going on in their health environment specifically. And that can cause a lot of errors for people in the public health field who want to be able to find and target the issues that affect certain communities. That's the entire reason EJScreens exist, right? Is to allow the community to have access to that data. A lot of the data is not provided in a way that is easily digestible by lay people and even by professionals. So this is all a part of an effort in just general public health to make this information easy to understand and easily accessible. Next slide, please. So what's going to happen in the future of MD EJSCREEN? I will get back to you on that after we do a quick demo of the site as it stands. The data set is pending an update, which should be released in, I believe, the next 3 weeks, I want to say. September 14th, if I remember correctly. Yeah, so it'd be the first Friday of October, the final update will go up. Oh. If you just press the Windows key, I can take it from there. Alrighty, so this is the EJScreen as it stands. It's a pretty lightweight tool, so you can actually pull it up on your phone and it should work just fine on most mobile devices. As I mentioned here, you have your legend, which shows the percentiles of the impact. Percentiles are generally equivalently distributed. If you go into this button right here, you get the layers and the legends. So there's only one layer in this because it is just the cumulative EJ score. If you click on any one county, you'll get all of the information about that county. So let's just do this random one in Howard County. I'm gonna, oh no. This mouse was not designed to be used on a podium, so I'll have to forgive my inaccuracy here. There we go. So I copied my little census tract, and I should be able to go into the next one over and just search it. I turned the layer off. I did turn the layer off. This should just take me there. Oh, no, it doesn't. If I had a keyboard, it would take me there. But anyways, you can go through the individual domains, and if you select any one of them, it'll show you all of the information, all of the information about that tool. All of these numbers are in percentiles, as I mentioned. Like I said, we don't show the raw values explicitly on the live tool just because they don't really provide any context. They have, if you have any interest in any one specific domain, so like let's just say I'm interested in seeing the distribution of the cancer rates, you just go into your layers right here and turn off the first layer and find the one that you're interested in. So this NADA data is the one that has the cancer rates in it, and this kind of shows the distribution of cancer rates within the state of Maryland. Ditto for asthma or really anything else you're interested in here. Further developments are going to include additional weighting tools and tools to select and condense the data, and also to create easy reports to help to allow people to just like find the data set that they're interested in, print it out, and send it to somebody. And I can go back to the slides. All right. So yes, so as I mentioned, the main things we're going to be working on are a dynamic mapping tool. So this is creating the ability for people to set the threshold cutoffs for whatever value they're looking for, and that would just display immediately. Include the additional blocks of analysis, so taking the data sets we have and proportionally, or determining them proportionally how they would line up if they were reset into census blocks, legislative districts, things of that nature, school districts, so that you can have a better understanding of, how does my state legislator, how does he or she feel about, the fact that her legislative or their legislative district is, one of the worst in the state or one of the best in the state, thing of that nature. And then, as I mentioned, we need to reassess our weighting methods. There are some big errors caused in the way data is being collected or being analyzed in just all EJ screens, and there needs to be more statistical testing about how that data is then processed and distributed back out to communities. Next slide, please. So we're always looking to, this is a running project. Developments happen usually every 6 months to a year. If there are ever any suggestions about how things could be improved, we're always happy to hear them. My email and the email for Siege itself is going to be at the end of the slide, and I encourage everybody to, if you have any opinions, questions, comments, think I should look at something else to kind of get inspiration, I'm always happy to hear it. We also are going to be looking at doing a more concerted effort to do community engagement to get that feedback. We're currently working with Johns Hopkins and I can't remember, another university, escapes my memory, to develop a Maryland EJSCREEN 4.0. So we'll be including a lot of new statistical methods. Usually the big number, when the big number changes, it's usually because we've done a large update to the statistical methodology. Now, maybe not necessarily the UI or the UX, but we do it when we do a big data update or a big change in our methodology. The small number, so the fact that we're on 0.2 is just because we're doing a general data update. We're just taking in the new data that came out and just incorporating it into our original model. So all of the errors that existed in the 3.1 are going to carry over into 3.2, but development of 4.0 hopes to obviously reduce those statistical errors. Next slide. Oh, sorry, can you go back one? The other thing we're going to be doing is we're going to be integrating the EJ qualifications of, or the EJ burden qualifications that the Maryland State Legislature has set out, which means out of a data set of, I believe, 14 data points, if any census tract has a higher than 75th percentile in any 3 of those data sets, then it's considered overburdened by the EJ score, and so we'll be incorporating that distinction into the next available update, so that the 3.2 update, as I mentioned, I think that will be released in October, the first Monday of October. And that's really important because there is a lot of conversation being had within the EJSCREEN community about how legislatures define environmental justice burden. I think that's been mentioned several times throughout this whole symposium, is that there is a discoordination between how data sets identify environmentally burdened communities and how those communities are actually being environmentally burdened. As I mentioned earlier, these tools are not diagnostic tools. They are not so accurate that you can use them to kind of determine the reality on the ground. In order to determine reality on the ground, you have to go to the ground. And I am a data scientist by profession, and I think a big portion of data science is understanding the limitations of the data that's being captured. Your information is only as good as the data that's being collected, and obviously you can't collect all the data about everybody in the state or in the country. So we're going to be including this, this qualification into the data set to basically show that these numbers may not be necessarily related. Obviously it's not a scientifically proven conclusion, but it is just a visual representation for community members to kind of understand that, no, you're not crazy. Even though the state says you're not environmentally justice burdened, you might actually be environmentally burdened by another metric. Next slide, please. And so just to, real quick, just to kind of show what these tools are being used for. As I mentioned, this is the third version. We've had a version up since 2020, I believe, or 21. And so these metrics are really important, specifically as it pertains to disbursement of grant funds. So if you looked at the Community Change Grant, which is the big grant pool that's been, or funding pool that's been assigned for Justice 40 initiatives, they have a very stringent criteria of how that money is being dispersed geographically. And these types of data sets are being used to determine how that money is being dispersed. Like I said, there's good and bad in that because the data can't know everything. So having it as a singular cutoff point, in my opinion, is maybe not the wisest move, but it is what is being done. This information is also being used to help communities advocate for their own specific and community-based research, right? To be able to show to state authorities that, hey, according to this data set, this data tool, we are experiencing a higher rate of nitrate runoff than other communities. We need our representatives to do something about that, right? This information can be then carried over to them and just say, hey, what are you doing? So that's the two main ways this is being used. Next slide. So as I mentioned, is it 14? I'm not going to count them now. I'm pretty sure it's around 14. So these are the indicators that are currently being used by the EJSCREEN or by the Maryland Department of Environment to determine whether or not areas are in fact overburdened. So as you can see, there's large parts of Maryland that are not being considered. So while it very well may be the case that those places are not environmentally overburdened, this data set is not comprehensive enough to capture everything that might be happening. And obviously no data set can be, but there's a lot of improvement that can be done on this data set. Specifically, there's no domain in this that accounts for climate change. And as we've all experienced over this last few summers now, heat is the deadliest climate event that happens, point blank, period. It causes the most health problems, it causes the most damage, and people are not prepared for it, especially even though we're in Maryland and there are parts of it that are pretty swampy, but not the whole state, and obviously not the rest of the country. That's not really being captured in this data set. There is also, as I mentioned previously, AQI data is notoriously hard to capture on a small scale. So a lot of the data sets that are being used are data that is collected from a very small number of wide capture sensors. And while those sensors are really great for giving people some context into the air quality in the state, they can't capture how pollution might flow around or through a building or on a block, or if you live downwind from a sewage plant, they can't capture how specifically that impacts your neighborhood because it's obviously on such a wide scale. So as I mentioned in interpolation, the method of predicting values along a wide area causes error, and that error, may not happen in your favor. Next slide, please. So just to wrap up, the MD EJSCREEN and all EJSCREENs are community-focused tools. These are tools that we want average people to just, when they're curious, to go on and just check. We, as part of SIEGE, we offer technical assistance and have in the past and will in the future be offering, educational opportunities for community members to just learn about the tool, how they can access it, how they can use it, and basically how to interpret the numbers, and give them the ability to self-advocate from a more data-focused standpoint. Also, like I said, we're using it to help inform how those grant funds are being dispersed and whether or not the goals of Justice 40 are being met by other reasonably applied metrics. And then lastly, we would like for this tool to be used to influence policy, to help people, to help policymakers and advocates have a better understanding of what their advocacy or policy should be targeting in order to improve the environmental justice burden in the state of Maryland. Next slide. As part of SIEGE, we also have a lot of other EJS tools. I'm sure I'm missing some of them up there. We have a Mid-Atlantic screening tool, which encompasses Delaware, Maryland, North and South Carolina, some other places. We have a CGIST mapping tool, which is more focused on North and South Carolina specifically. And if you're wondering, why don't you just take portions of the data from the first tool and put it in the second? Some of it is, but like I mentioned earlier, these tools need to be localized and they need to be able to capture considerations for the individual states. And I believe it's South Carolina, or is it North Carolina? One of the Carolinas has one of the highest North Carolina has the highest hog population per capita of the entire country. And hogs produce a lot of unique environmental burdens that are not seen on even wide-scale chicken farms or cow farms, right? And so that information is used to color the data sets that are collected and how those are weighted. Next slide. And then if you have any questions or comments. Go ahead.
Thank you, first of all, for taking the time to present on this. My question, it came up a couple times in your presentation. You were talking about education, which is mostly directed towards communities, which obviously makes a lot of sense. How much engagement with lawmakers and policymakers in terms of explaining what the strengths, weaknesses, et cetera, doing SWOT analysis on this, to actual lawmakers? Regulators, like within MDE, I feel like have a decent idea of what the issue is, but for the legislators themselves, like when it comes up in legislation, you alluded to this, it comes up, for instance, in permitting. Like, so MDE tried to have the EJ permitting bill the last few years. It hasn't passed in terms of capacity and jurisdiction, but it is baked in that you have to file if you're a developer, if you're in an EJ score X, Y, or Z.
Sure.
How much engagement has been done with lawmakers? Because I get the impression some have a really good idea of what that means, and some don't. And so when they're talking about like expanding jurisdiction, there's all of this pushback of like, oh God, like it's like a million things that a developer is going to have to attack to do this. It's impossible. Industry will never be able to develop anything. Yada yada yada. This is a long question, so I'm just going to stop myself now.
No, go ahead. Just to make sure I understood you correctly, so you're asking why or what efforts are SIEGE or just researchers in general making to help policymakers understand how these data tools are analyzed and how they should be used when crafting legislation. So this is actually a running question or a running thing I've spoken with folks at MDE about because there is a not high degree of scientific literacy amongst policymakers, which is to say obviously not all policymakers aren't smart or anything. It's a different skill set, but there is a general consensus that policymakers have a fundamentally misunderstanding how the data is collected, specifically how the data is collected, and how the data can be employed. So to answer your question, we don't actually do any advocacy or anything of that nature. If legislators come to us for, which hasn't happened while I've worked here, but if they would ever be interested in contacting us, hint, hint, wink, wink, legislators, we'd be happy to give them a crash course on these things so they can be more informed. But legislators are also parts of their community. So when we go out to do these community education sessions, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if there are, city council members or something along those lines. I believe I've had a state legislator in one of our community sessions, and they just introduced themselves as so-and-so, and I didn't find out they were a legislator until later. So I know that this is something that a lot of people in policy are interested in getting more informed about. The issue, obviously, then, is the politics of it all. There is a general, like I said, there's a general misconception of how the data is collected. And so, one of the funnier conversations I've had with somebody at MDE is, we get this, we get the remit from the statute of what we have to collect, but we don't ever get any reasoning why we should be collecting this data or why we should be compiling it in such a way, which I think is a problem that I mentioned earlier with the Maryland EJSCREEN, the MD EJSCREEN, is that there is no generally recognized consensus, even within the data science and EJ community, over what merits an EJSCREEN burden. So the long-winded answer to your long-winded question is that this is something that we would like to do more of to communicate to policy members, and but I think in general there needs to be a wider conversation within the EJ community to create a sort of standardization for these tools and a logic behind that standardization in order to make that engagement more impactful. Yes, sir. So I haven't had that kind of question or conversation with anybody at MDE. I'm sure if you talk with folks on the EJ team in MDE, they'd be happy to give you an answer on that.
Have they ever shared any insights about how they think about the question of how would they utilize these tools or different tools for informing permitting decisions?
They haven't. I haven't gotten any insight from them on that.
Do they have any insights on that?
No, I mean not to my knowledge. I don't work for them though, so I couldn't answer that. So just for the folks on stream, if you didn't hear, the question was: has anybody from MDE given in my conversation with them given me any insight into how they're using this to impact permitting? Yeah, the long and short of it is I don't know. I would assume, but.
The background to the question is that most of these tools, as they evolved in the EJ space, has been found to be highly appropriate for making targeting or prioritization and resource allocation. That's a different decision context than permitting, right? Which
Yeah.
is a much more regulatory process. And so the question of whether or not, what is needed to inform, different types of decisions is a question in the background of this, right? Not every method and set of data is going to be useful for every decision.
I mean, from my perspective, and I mentioned this earlier in the talk, is that these tools are not diagnostic tools. So using them for in a prescriptive manner, such as permitting, right, where the idea of the permit is to maybe limit the environmental justice burden, a newly developing environmental justice burden from occurring. These tools are not the best tools to use for that purpose specifically. So in my opinion, I would say any sort of permitting methodology would have to assess the individual data sets in order to make that permitting decision. You would have to, you would have to look at the nitrogen in the nitrogen runoff and the brownfield proximity. You'd have to look at those things individually in order to make any permitting decision, in my opinion. Anytime you're creating a tool that coalesces a large data set, you're going to get data loss. That's just how these things work. You can never combine everything in such a way where you don't lose information. And so that's why I think that probably wouldn't be the best use of these sort of tools, even one developed within the government.
Be a little bit more nuanced than that, right? Because originally, like EJSCREEN and CalEnviroScreen and all these were, when they were developed, there was a huge disclaimer that says these are not to be used for regulatory or risk assessment purposes and things like that. But, and so they were originally intended to say, where are the places where there are EJEX concerns such that we should have more, more attention, right? But it turned out that these could be used, these screening tools could be used to allocate resources. And that became, both a methodological issue and a policy issue, right? Because it just so happened that everybody agreed that they could be used like that, right? And that is a huge development because getting resources to these communities is a huge issue, right? So, I think that a blanket statement that they're not useful for quote unquote diagnostic purposes, it maybe should be tempered by the fact that for certain types of decisions that these tools are very appropriate, have been found to be very appropriate, and everybody agrees that they're appropriate, so, and that's something I think we all learned in this process, I mean, in California, as I learned, when CalEnviroScreen first came out, there was a whole bunch of people that were opposed to it, like a lot of local governments and stuff like that. But then when it got attached to the law that uses to allocate resources, everybody was in support of it. So it was, and in fact, there was a, there was a lot of, it was the business industry and local governments that were primarily like, wanting to keep as far away from it as possible, and then when SB 535 was passed, and, a lot of, essentially billions of dollars were going to be used there, the question was, how come I'm not included in it, but, that's the way it unfolded, but I think, what we all need to learn is that, yeah, there are limitations, but they can be used, and people agree they can be used, and that's really important because we got to get to the point of actually making decisions.
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent point. Where when I'm sure other data scientists mention that it shouldn't be used as a diagnostic tool, it doesn't mean that it shouldn't be used at all, right? There are appropriate ways to use this. Allocation of funding, in my opinion, is a fine way to use these tools because these are decisions that kind of have to be made with a larger contextual understanding for your area, but it doesn't absolve us from acknowledging where these might fall short and how we can be improving these tools to make these disbursements of grant funds more equitable and, in fact, more effective, right? Because at the end of the day, if a state starts pouring money into a census tract as a result of their environmental screen score, and like I said, nobody lives in that census tract, or a lot of people live in that census tract. It can have a very disproportionate effect on the general EJ burden for that community. So while it's not a diagnostic tool, and while it does have its limitations, I think funding allocation is a fine way to use it, because as I mentioned earlier, policymakers are not the most scientifically literate people, right? They have other things in their head. So we have to kind of bridge that gap to make these, scientifically complex and statistically complex theories into a very quick and easy thing to understand. And that's what these tools are generally used for. But yes, thank you. Yes, sir.
Assuming that the other schools in the system and the private, meaning have to buy into this screening, would it not be possible to speak to the President of the Senate and the President of the Senate, Speaker of the House of Delegates, and have a tutorial prior to the session starting, going through all the ramifications?
I mean, there's no reason why it can't be done. We can't instigate that conversation as a.
You could invite them to it. You could invite the President of the Senate and the Speaker of the House.
Of course, yeah, but there is a limit to what conduct we as a product of the university can do in regards to advocating for certain things. But again, hint, hint, wink, wink to any legislators watching. We are always willing to sit down with them individually or as part of a general, education session in order to give them a better idea of these. But as we could not ourselves go to Annapolis to do that for them in the halls of the Senate, that would cross some ethical guidelines that we have. But yeah, and some tax ones too, I'm sure. That being said, we have been, when we provide this information to communities can advocate for this tool on their own behalf, right? There's nothing stopping individual community members from going and taking the ideas they learn from these sessions and communicating those effectively to policymakers. And we obviously definitely advocate for folks to help educate people. There's nothing political in that. Yes, sir.
You suggested several times that the school has gone out into the communities for presentations. I've never heard of one. I don't know that you've ever come to the community I live in. How does a community go about inviting?
Of course. Sir, if you could go to the next slide for me. Best way to do that is to reach out. That's my email at the bottom if you can see it, and I'm happy to write it down on a piece of paper for you if you can't. But we also have a question survey on our website that's checked pretty frequently, that if you ask for any sort of assistance in education or in grant, technical assistance for your grants, things like that, we definitely are available to help out. We are a pretty small lab, all things being equal. So we don't have the capacity to go out and into communities kind of ad hoc or instigate those conversations on our own. But we are more than happy to provide that to your community. So I highly recommend you reach out, and we could definitely get something scheduled for your church. We've done them in churches. We've done them in local community center conferences. We've done them almost. I've done some with community members almost one-on-one. I think maybe it was 2 people who asked for one for a quick rundown of these tools, and I was able to meet them over Zoom and have these conversations. But yeah, please reach out if you would like to learn more, if you would like us to introduce this to your community. And unfortunately, I believe that is our time. Thank you all very much for coming. And if you have any questions, I'll be around. And I'm happy to talk about these things further. And I believe lunch is on soon.
You are E. Strauss?
I am E. Strauss.